Indie horror games offer some of the most unique and unforgettable experiences in gaming. In this series, I'll dive through the creepiest titles, new and old. Tonight, I want to run through a full playthrough and analysis of the psychological horror, Mouthwashing. Welcome to the series, and welcome to the Dread Factory. Mouthwashing, created by developer Wrong Organ, launched in September 2024 and follows a small crew aboard a freighter spaceship on a year-long delivery mission under the organisation Pony Express. The game delves into the lives of 5 crew members whose interpersonal conflicts, personal traumas and corporate mistreatment drive them towards a devastating collapse. The crew consists of Curly, the captain, ANYA, the ship's medic, Jimmy, the co-pilot, SWANSEA, a hard-nosed yet skilled mechanic, and finally, DAISUKE, Swansea's eager and optimistic intern. The game's narrative is non-linear, think Donnie Darko or Reservoir Dogs, and plays out in disjointed sequences in the weeks and months before and after a major incident. This results in horrifying moments, bizarre surrealism, and multiple disturbing revelations throughout the course of the game. To make things a little more straightforward though, I'll run through things in as close to chronological order as I can get. The story begins with the crew already partway through their delivery mission, and we're gradually introduced to each character through interactions that reveal their personalities and roles aboard the ship. The early scenes show that Curly presents himself as a steadfast leader. ANYA, the medic, intimates that she's uncomfortable around Jimmy, whose behaviour during his own previous psych evaluations hints at inappropriate tendencies, as he references being sexually attracted to cartoon horses. Because of this, you, playing as Curly, agree to perform Jimmy's next evaluation on ANYA's behalf. En route, you're met with surreal hallucinations of falling into a red lake, warning signs and broken ladders, appearing to symbolise Curly's growing anxiety and foreshadowing the looming collapse of his authority. Jimmy's evaluation occurs next, which further compounds this, as he refers to Curly already reaching the top of the corporate ladder while he continues to climb it. Corporate dictates that only one big group event is allowed per year, so the crew opts to have one big joint birthday party for Curly. It's at this moment Curly decides to disclose that he's received a notification from corporate that the crew will be laid off at the mission's end, causing the crew's morale to decline rapidly. Their reactions vary wildly. ANYA is anxious about her future as she has no savings. DAISUKE doesn't say anything, SWANSEA appears resigned, and Jimmy erupts in anger, taking his frustrations out on every member of the crew, stating that Curly must be happy that he can rid himself of his responsibilities, guilt-free. He attacks ANYA for never getting into medical school, inferring that she's incapable of doing so, suggests SWANSEA is at the end of the line for employment due to his age, and that DAISUKE will be fine because his parents will look after him. Meanwhile, he will go back to his own struggle of a life. You then cut the birthday cake with what appears to be a fucking sword, and cutting it is weird though, almost like it's sawing through meat? ANYA confides in Curly during a quiet sequence where they gaze upon an artificial night sky. While she finds it peaceful, she mentions that there's one dead pixel in the corner of the image, and it's always in the back of her mind. Curly doesn't see it and brushes it off, stating that he prefers to see the bigger picture. ANYA then asks how long is left on the trip. 8 months. This prompts her to ask why Pony Express didn't put locks on the bedrooms, but did add them to the medical room door, clearly alluding to the company caring more about medical supplies than the well-being of the crew. This is especially haunting as she is the only woman among a crew of men. Days later, you discover that ANYA is deeply distressed and has taken a locked gun case to the cockpit. It's here ANYA reveals that she's become pregnant as she was assaulted by co-pilot Jimmy. Jimmy is unaware at this point, and ANYA wants to hide the gun case from him to stop him from doing anything stupid when he finds out. While Curly says he'll do anything he can to help, heartbreakingly, Curly reacts passively, seeking to maintain peace by talking it out with Jimmy rather than address the issue head on, and leaves ANYA increasingly vulnerable. Before Curly takes any action, ANYA tells Jimmy of her pregnancy. This triggers a catastrophic moment as Jimmy now begins to wrestle with what will happen when the crew returns to Earth, knowing his assault of ANYA will become public, as the length of the delivery mission means that the baby will be born before they arrive home. He tells Curly that, as the captain, he's on the hook for what he did too, claiming that he's just as guilty as he is for what he allowed to happen, attempting to manipulate him. Jimmy offers an alternative solution where, despite the best efforts of the captain, the crew dies and are never found, only remembered as a tragedy. Curly doesn't argue. Jimmy tells Curly that he'll take care of it, and then walks away towards the cockpit. Jimmy heads to the cockpit, disables the autopilot and steers the ship into an asteroid, before leaving the cockpit and experiencing some kind of mental breakdown. Curly intervenes but is unable to prevent the collision and is critically injured. The ship, now filled with expanding foam to hold the hull together, becomes a physical manifestation of the crew's emotional and psychological state, fractured and barely holding together. We pick back up 2 months after the crash. Up until this point, you've been solely playing as the captain, Curly, but in every sequence from now onwards, you take control of Jimmy. After the accident, Curly can be found in medical, relying solely on the crew for his survival. Unable to speak, covered in bloody bandages and missing all hands and feet, he's forced to watch as his crew falls to pieces while they believe that he's responsible for the crash. This is perhaps symbolic of him being previously indecisive and refusing to take action in favour of keeping the peace, and he's now unable to take any action at all. To manage his pain, he's required to be fed painkillers, something Anya struggles to do as the noises he makes and the clear emotional trauma behind forced insertion she has are deeply overwhelming. This leads to you, now playing as a self-appointed stand-in captain Jimmy, criticising Anya and questioning her ability. I mentioned earlier that the game's non-linear narrative jumps around frequently, and this scene is actually very early on for you as a player. Because of this, I really thought that Anya was just a bad medic, and I couldn't understand why she was so anxious all the time. It's only when viewed through a different lens how horrible her situation has become, as she is simply trying to protect herself and avoid confrontation with Jimmy after his SA. But I suppose that's the power of having a narrative that's provided by the abuser. Jimmy finds Swansea guarding the utility room door, which is where the cryostasis pods are located. Pods that could sustain a crew member for 20 years. He states that the room is covered in a thick wall of foam and that he doesn't trust anyone else to clear it. This long after the crash, the surviving crew faces dwindling supplies and increasing desperation to be rescued, something that doesn't appear to be forthcoming. They eventually decide to open the cargo hold, which they had avoided up until now due to the corporate penalties for tampering with the cargo. To their horror, they discover that the entire hold is filled exclusively with mouthwash, a trivial, almost laughable cargo compared to the risks that they have endured. The crew is crushed by the realisation that their lives were deemed expendable by the company and that their mission was nothing more than transporting a mass-produced, mundane product. Anya also notes that the sugar content of the mouthwash is so high that it actually renders it useless as a disinfectant anyway. Swansea, disillusioned and discovering the ethanol content, begins drinking the mouthwash, breaking his streak of 15 years of sobriety. DAISUKE joins him, attempting to lighten the mood, but it underscores the growing sense of futility among the group. Meanwhile, Anya becomes increasingly distressed by the addition of alcohol to their dire situation, heightening her feelings of hopelessness. Jimmy finds himself within a surreal sequence in front of a TV, surrounded by boxes. Behind the TV, you actually catch a glimpse of Curly behind the racks. The TV plays out shows and films foreshadowing events later in the game that further hint at corporate policies that prioritise profit over crew welfare. You also see an ad for the mouthwash that claims it kills 99.9% of bacteria. It states that you should consult a medical professional before, during and after use, and that the company claims no liability for any adverse effects. 3 months after the crash, Jimmy awakes to the sound of Curly in agony in the medical bay. Checking on him, you're unsure if he's taken his painkillers, so you need to locate Anya to find out. You find Anya talking with Swansea in the cockpit, mid-conversation. Anya, crying, tells Swansea she completely understands, but it's unclear what she's referring to, but I'll pick back up on that later. Anya states that giving Curly his medication has slipped her mind, and Jimmy insists that he'll do it instead, all while Swansea stands there with the axe in hand. Returning to the med bay, Jimmy gives Curly his painkillers again, but not before making a backhanded comment about how he's only in the driver's seat because of him, and thanks him for it. We're played the sound of Curly taking his pills again, except this time it sounds like Jimmy beats him. Jimmy is refusing to acknowledge that he's the reason that Curly is in this state. Skipping forward to 4 months after the crash, the hope of rescue fades and the crew spirals further. Anya informs Jimmy that there are more medical supplies buried within the foam in the hallway by medical, and that using the axe currently being looked after by Swansea, you can cut it away. When asking a drunken Swansea for the axe, he agrees to hand it over before swinging it into an image of the sun on the large screen in the lounge. Another act of foreshadowing. Jimmy gains access to the medical supplies and is then asked again to give Curly his painkillers. At this point, Anya is at least 4 months pregnant, so these tasks are likely becoming more and more difficult for her. Refusing to acknowledge that he is the reason for this difficulty, he blows up at her, listing off all of the things that she's asked him to do throughout the course of their journey. Skipping forward to 5 months after the crash, we discover that Anya has locked herself and Curly in the medical bay, telling Jimmy that he was right and that she's going to do what she should have done all along. We can only assume that she's referring to Jimmy's initial reaction to her pregnancy. DAISUKE, desperate to prove himself, embarks on the dangerous task of crawling through a collapsed ventilation shaft to access the medical bay after being manipulated into doing so by Jimmy, who states that they can save Curly by doing so. But before that, we slip into another bizarre dreamlike sequence. In it, Curly, who is sat by a birthday cake, tells Jimmy that the best parts in life are better for the bad experiences we have. He says that you should eat some cake and sends you on a fetch quest for something to cut it. You head out and find the axe buried in a seat within the cockpit. When you return, Curly is lying on the table, and clicking him and selecting the axe allows you to draw it back briefly before the game stalls. Returning to reality, we pick up right where we left off before the dream sequence. You need to gain access to the utility room so DAISUKE can climb into the ventilation shaft, but need to get past Swansea first. Jimmy does this by mixing a cocktail with the only remaining isopropyl alcohol aboard the ship to knock him out, seemingly already knowing that a cocktail like this could render a person unconscious and produce a blind spot in their memory. Once incapacitated, you take Swansea's key, which appears to have a swan keyring attached to it, likely leaning into the fiercely protective nature of swans. Don't ever piss off a swan, I can testify to that. This also foreshadows an event with Swansea later on, but I'll get to that shortly. Jimmy and DAISUKE enter the utility room to discover that it is not in fact filled with foam, and that while 3 of the cryostasis pods are covered, 1 remains in perfect working order. Jimmy accuses Swansea of wanting to keep the pod for himself, and DAISUKE refuses the narrative. The reality is, Swansea was more likely saving it for DAISUKE, and this is likely what was being discussed with Anya in the cockpit earlier on. Jimmy continues to manipulate DAISUKE and convinces him to climb into the vent that connects the utility room to the medical bay. DAISUKE is gravely injured during his mission, and after a brief argument, Jimmy and Swansea look to find something to disinfect his wounds. When entering the med bay, Jimmy's vision of the bed where Curly lays and the area around it are completely obscured, almost as if he's refusing to acknowledge what's there, but I'll clear that up in a sec. Heading towards the cargo hold, Jimmy begins to hallucinate again. The cargo hold door has been replaced with a tombstone for DAISUKE, accompanied by one of the pink hibiscus flowers that adorn his shirt. It's here you encounter one of the few enemies in the game. A note explains that this is a blind beast and that you can't outrun it, likely symbolising Jimmy continually pushing away responsibilities onto other people. It's a nerve-wracking sequence where you must move as quietly as you can and remain still when the beast, taking the form of a giant, horrifying horse, draws close to you, indicated by rumbling boxes and unsettling noises. What the fuck? Once retrieving the mouthwash, Jimmy applies it to DAISUKE's injuries while he continues to apologise for what he perceives as messing up, while clearly in agony. Likely knowing he won't recover from his injuries, Swansea appears, holding the axe, referencing him being a ray of sunshine and mourning the fact that DAISUKE was just a good kid, trying his best, and that he could have learned a lot from someone so young and optimistic. He swings the axe into this ray of sunshine, just as he did when he gave the axe to Jimmy earlier. This also compounds the comparison between Swansea and the swan keyring, as they are known to be particularly brutal with their young if they are sick or injured. Jimmy then accuses Swansea of planning to take the last remaining cryostasis pod for himself. Swansea brushes this off and reveals that he knows about Jimmy assaulting Anya, and tells him that he can take the pod for himself, saying that when he gets back to Earth he can spin whatever story he'd like. Heading into the medical bay now, Jimmy's vision is no longer obscured. Anya, overwhelmed by her trauma and isolation, had taken her own life in the med bay next to the gun case I mentioned earlier. Once again, someone else's actions have let Jimmy off the hook, and he no longer needs to worry about the consequences of his actions. Now gaining access to the gun, Jimmy and Swansea's relationship deteriorates into outright hostility, culminating in a violent confrontation that I'm not certain is entirely real. The scene I'm referring to is the one within the cockpit where Swansea is attempting to break in with the axe. You have to scramble to secure the room by grabbing a rope and a pipe. This is before Swansea breaks through the door and the scene ends. This feels more like Jimmy's version of the narrative, where he attacks Swansea simply because he's defending himself. Could it be that the pipe and the rope were simply used to beat and tie Swansea up in the cargo hold? Within your inventory in this moment, there's also a blurred out object that, when selected, makes Jimmy say that he can't stop his hands from shaking. Is this the gun? Can he not bring himself to use it against Swansea because it doesn't feed into his narrative of being a hero and taking responsibility? Before we learn the truth, Jimmy enters more hallucinatory sequences. Journeying through the ventilation shafts again, you see DAISUKE and his flower, and are met with a note stating, "No turning back now," before having to complete a sequence where only moving backwards, away from Jimmy's responsibilities, will allow you to continue. You reach a vent surrounded by axes buried in a wall in a version of the medical bay turned on its side, before arriving in the cargo bay with a restrained Swansea and a gun. Shooting him takes you into a tense sequence where you must shoot Swansea 3 times in a crypt area as he runs around trying to attack you from behind with the axe. Once complete, you move into a scene where Swansea describes periods of dissatisfaction and happiness in his life in what is a sad but beautifully cinematic scene. Swansea reflects on his life, confessing a past filled with self-destructive behaviour, alcoholism and despair. A near-death vision prompted him to turn his life around, embracing sobriety, family and societal norms. Yet despite achieving stability and success, he admits that these accomplishments never brought the fulfillment he craved. Ironically, he finds his wild, reckless days, despite the chaos, were his most memorable and cherished moments. In a final reckoning, he accepts his flaws and failures but criticises Jimmy's selfishness and cowardice, his greatest regret being his failure to protect DAISUKE and provide him with a better future. Jimmy tells Swansea that he's going to fix everything and that they're going to make it. Swansea's response? Fuck you. Swansea is then executed by Jimmy. Jimmy is then back in the vents where you're met with a giant red mass, and when scanning it, it reveals several horse fetuses. Eventually, eyes form on the red mass and a centipede version of the Pony Express mascot, Polly, bursts out of the central slit. You're interrupted by a black screen and find yourself back in the vents with the centipede, which is eerily still. Oh, Jesus. It eventually rushes away through the vents and you must navigate through them without being caught by it. You're eventually transported to a door, and beyond this is a hallway with the floating ID cards of the employees, where ANYA's is the only one that is repeatedly obscured, Jimmy once again refusing to acknowledge her. The hallway leads up to a staircase where empty bottles of mouthwash begin to fall from above. Once arriving at the top, spotlights illuminate even larger mounds of mouthwash one by one, until a final light shows Polly standing in the centre. As Polly begins to speak, it's worth noting that it shares the same text colour as ANYA, perhaps bringing Jimmy's joke about being attracted to cartoon horses full circle, as he only sees ANYA and the horse as objects he can engage with sexually. Maybe I'm reaching, but I just really hate this guy. Polly remarks that Jimmy thinks he's caged and misunderstood as a result of his actions aboard the ship and, in his own words, has only made one mistake. Polly is now standing on the mound under moonlight, once again drawing a parallel to ANYA as she would fondly look at the artificial moonlight seen in the crew lounge. Jimmy reiterates that he and Curly can still make it, and that he will take responsibility for his actions. Disgustingly, he even uses ANYA's words to defend his actions with the line, "Our worst moments don't define us." Before he can finish, Polly cuts him off and asks, if all of that is true, why are you still so concerned with him? Back in the medical bay, you find yourself holding Curly where you must bring him to the lounge and place him on the table. The other seats around the table are taken by the deceased members of the crew who celebrate Jimmy's arrival. To feed the crew, you must cut off a chunk of Curly's leg, which will then be eaten by the whole crew.
Oh wow. I'm chopping again. I don't want to be chopping this time.
Jimmy addresses Curly by saying that despite how high and mighty Curly felt he was, he forgives him, along with the rest of the crew, nobly sacrificing a part of Curly's flesh for the good of the group, while reaffirming that he wants to take responsibility and see to it that they both survive. It's around this point where it seems Jimmy experiences a mental break. In a separate hallucination sequence, Jimmy walks through a hallway that scared the absolute crap out of me, as a giant version of Curly is seen beneath the grates on the floor. His eyes then fill in the room before we move on to a surreal scene where Curly is bound in front of a TV, covered in valves. In this scene, Jimmy must force feed Curly a piece of his own leg so that he can survive, twisting the valves to rearrange his organs so that the flesh can be ingested. Failing to organise the valves correctly results in Curly regurgitating the piece of flesh, and you must start again. Once successful, you click on the TV which now says "Help me," and another incredible scene plays out in which Jimmy envisions Curly engulfed in flames. In this scene, Curly offers to be the villain, absolving Jimmy and allowing him to be the better man. Disappointment, breaking down, makes a frankly shitty attempt at taking responsibility, claiming that he and Curly can both be heroes and that he'll keep him alive. Back at the dining table of the world's worst birthday party, Jimmy picks up Curly and takes him to the cryostasis pod, believing that he is making the ultimate sacrifice to earn Curly's forgiveness while simply making another bad decision. Gypshit places Curly into the pod, walks off screen and takes his own life, not even waiting to ensure that the pod still works. The pod does appear to work, but painfully, it's likely that Curly's ending is a fate worse than death anyway. He'll exist in that pod for 20 years, but due to how little Pony Express care about their staff, he'll likely never be found. He'll wake up decades later in the same pain as he is now and die from his injuries or starvation. Thanks again, Jickwad. Mouthwashing is undeniably a masterclass in psychological horror, weaving themes of corporate neglect, interpersonal trauma and moral decay into a chilling tale. The non-linear storytelling, surreal sequences and symbolic horror make it a deeply unsettling but unforgettable experience. Jimmy's arc is haunting, a man desperate to rationalise his sins and seek redemption, only to spiral further into cowardice and selfishness, dragging everyone around him down with him. But it's Anya's story that is by far the most harrowing. She begins as the ship's medic, someone tasked with caring for the crew, but ended up bearing the weight of unimaginable trauma, isolation and betrayal. From the company's complete disregard for her safety, to the assault she suffered and the indifference of those meant to protect her, Anya's fate is a harsh reminder of how neglect and abuse can fester as her voice was silenced, her struggles overlooked, and her humanity discarded. Thank you so much for checking out this video and the first game that I've played through and analysed for my Dread Factory series. If you're as fascinated by these dark indie gems as I am, please be sure to like and subscribe, and drop a comment below with any games you think I should check out. Until next time, this is Mikey Lee signing out from the Dread Factory.